Everyone knew her as a kind elderly woman, but no one knew her past. Martha McGarrett was a former military consultant, accustomed to working in war zones. Now she lives on a farm, but when the biker gang Devil's Skulls, linked to a drug cartel, arrives in her town, she is forced to remember what war truly means. The gang takes over businesses, intimidates locals, and eliminates those who stand in their way. The law is bought, and the police turn a blind eye. But Martha is not one to back down. She gathers a group of veterans to fight back. As they prepare for battle, Martha comes across damning evidence against the cartel, a game changer. She decides to hand it over to an FBI agent, but will she make it in time before the gang comes for her? The final showdown is inevitable. Who will survive this fight? Stay with us to find out how this story ends. Subscribe so you don't miss it. She stepped out onto the porch early in the morning, when the sun had just touched the tops of the fir trees along the horizon. There was something refreshing and eerie about the cold pre-dawn air at the same time. There was no trace of summer greenery left yet. A thin layer of snow lay on the slopes around the farm, and a sharp wind from the north carried with it a premonition of a long winter. Her name was Martha McGarrett, and she was a woman who had lived a long and challenging life. And now, at 67, she held a gun in her hands as confidently as she had done 40 years ago when she worked as a military consultant overseas. The farm she now lived on had been in her family for 3 generations, but strangers in powerful pickup trucks and motorcycles had begun to appear more and more often in these Montana mountains, as if they were looking for something or someone. Martha wasn't afraid of them. She had lived too long and seen too much to be afraid of people who screamed louder than they shot and hid their weakness behind brutal jackets. But recent rumors and strange visits suggested that there was a more serious danger in the area. Once upon a time, she had been an excellent student in school, then a determined cadet at a military academy where she served in intelligence. She had traveled to almost every continent, seen empires fall, and a new world order emerge from chaos. Her past contained many stories that only a few people, trusted allies, and rare commanders knew about. The pages of her service that remained declassified included a number of combat missions, from hostage rescue operations to complex special missions that cannot be spoken about out loud even now. When the pain and bitterness of loss became too strong, she remembered why she did all this, for her family, for those who did not have the opportunity to protect themselves. That sense of duty and selfless love for the people who called her native Montana their home still lived inside her. That is why now, standing on her porch, Martha felt the familiar rush of adrenaline and readiness for battle squeeze her chest. The spirit was still as strong, only the shoulders became a little more hunched. Her granddaughter, young Abby, remained in the house, whom Martha adopted after her daughter's death. Abby grew up a smart girl, ready for the harsh life on the farm, but Martha did not want her granddaughter to repeat her military path. Let her choose something different, peaceful, far from blood and battles. However, recent events hinted that a quiet life here may no longer exist. Over the past few months, a large group of bikers calling themselves the Devil's Skulls appeared in the area. At first, they quietly looked around, then bought an old garage on the outskirts of the nearest town, and soon began to seize local businesses and land. Some said that drug cartels were behind them. Someone claimed that they were just pawns in the hands of an even larger organization, but everyone agreed on one thing: they were dangerous. Marta wasn't used to relying on empty rumors. She had connections in the veteran community and among former comrades now working in various federal agencies. She made a few calls, trying to find out something about the Devil's Skulls. The answers, although sparse, were alarming. The group had already made its mark in 2 or 3 states, where it suddenly bought up plots of land and real estate at a bargain price, or simply intimidated the owners until they agreed to the deal. As a result, some ranches and farms unexpectedly passed into the hands of these people. And for some reason, the legal mechanisms of justice did not work, either because of corruption or because of banal bureaucracy and red tape. First, they went to Martha's neighbor, an elderly farmer named Henry. Henry was blind in one eye and had no combat training. He was a kind and trusting man. At first, the bikers offered to buy his land, then threatened him, and when he refused, unknown people set fire to his barn. Henry could not prove the involvement of the Devil's Skulls in this, and the police just threw up their hands. 3 weeks later, Henry, fearing for the safety of his wife, nevertheless sold the farm on inhumanely unfavorable terms and went to relatives in another state. The land that had belonged to him for more than 50 years was now in the hands of an unknown company. Martha saw that this was only the beginning. In such quiet places as the mountainous part of Montana, which seemed a blessed place for those who loved simplicity and silence, centuries-old traditions of life were systematically beginning to break down. The new power in the form of criminal structures sowed fear, and the lack of proper support from the law left people alone with trouble. And yet, not everyone was ready to give up. Martha knew that there were other veterans in the town. There were young guys from the National Guard ready to protect their home, but they lacked coordination, knowledge, confidence in their own strength. The bikers, in turn, turned out to be well armed, perhaps even with military equipment. Their leader was named Marcus Holt, a tall man with tattoos on his arms and an invariable leather vest. Every time he appeared in town, people felt uneasy. He spoke with a smile that had no trace of kindness in it, and looked at his interlocutor as if he were calculating how much effort it would take to make him obey. One recent day, Holt had personally confronted Martha when she came into town to buy spare parts for her tractor. At first, he had tried to be nice, saying that it would be a good idea for her to take a break and sell her land while there were good offers. Martha had ignored him, making it clear that she was not going to take part in this conversation. Then Holt had narrowed his eyes and started listing the possible problems that might await her. He had mentioned the fire at Henry's farm, as if by accident. He had not made any direct threats, but the meaning was clear. Either she agreed, or they would find a way to squeeze her out. Martha had only smiled back. She had smiled as coldly as he had smiled at her. She knew from her own military experience that such people who reveled in power and intimidation loved to break the weak in spirit, but when faced with someone who would not look away, they were often at a loss. But as he left, Holt muttered, "This isn't the end, Granny. I think we'll talk some more." Martha said nothing, just watched him go, trying to memorize his gait, his mannerisms, the little details, everything that might be useful if it came to open conflict. Her eyes were already gleaming with fighting determination. That evening, when she got home, she sat in the kitchen for a long time, studying an old phone book. Then she called a couple of friends. These people had long since settled in different places, but each of them was a legend in narrow circles. Some were called the best snipers, others, an unrivaled expert on explosives. All of them were part of a special, unofficial group of veterans who had once served together. She had not spoken to some of them for a long time. Sometimes she did not even know if the person was alive, but she decided to take a chance. One of them answered, a man named Bridger Hawkins, who was still faithful to his old friendship. Hearing the tense notes in Martha's voice, he only briefly asked if she needed help. Having received an affirmative answer, he said that he was leaving at dawn. He did not pry for details, and she did not explain unnecessary things. Everything would be clear when he arrived and saw everything with his own eyes. Last night she had a dream in which the old oak tree at the entrance to the forest where she had once played as a child suddenly blossomed amid the snow. A gray crow sat in its branches, and Martha heard its croaking words, prophesying something evil. She woke up in a cold sweat, feeling a strange premonition, as if the earth itself was calling out to her for protection. Since childhood, she had lived among these mountains and forests, learning the paths and river bends by heart. Her grandmother had once told her about the spirits of the mountains, about some primordial force that lived in these gorges. Martha was not religious in the classical sense, but she believed that there was something deeper than just the visible world. In the war, she had encountered more than one situation when some intuition or inner confidence saved her life. Maybe these are coincidences, or maybe an echo of those very mountain spirits, but she has learned not to ignore premonitions. Sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of bitter coffee, Martha continued to think about Abby. The girl was growing up capable. She knew how to ride a horse, she could fix minor problems around the house herself, and she was great with the guide dog that had once belonged to Henry. The dog had stayed with them after the neighbor left and was now Abby's devoted friend. Martha didn't want her granddaughter to encounter this criminal nightmare and see the horror of violence and cruelty. But she had no choice. The girls in the area already understood that the new arrivals would stop at nothing. There was tension in the air, and it was no longer possible to hide what was happening. Early the next morning, a pickup truck pulled up to the farmhouse porch. A stocky man in a heavy jacket stepped out, clutching a backpack to his chest. His hair was streaked with gray, and his face showed signs of a sleepless journey. It was Bridger Hawkins. As soon as he saw Marta, he broke into a smile and hugged her as if she were his own sister. 10 years ago, he had been a contractor, had glowing recommendations, and was highly trained. There were rumors that he had taken part in covert operations in South America. Marta knew that Bridger was a man of action, and there was no need to talk to him much. They exchanged short phrases. "How was your trip?" "I'll handle it. Good to see you," and immediately got to the point. She briefly described the situation: bikers, threats, land buyouts, political corruption. Bridger listened grimly and asked if Martha had tried contacting the local sheriff. It turned out the sheriff, a woman named Elaine Chester, was a good one, but she had few resources and few properly trained deputies. She had tried to get the attention of the state government, but they had responded with empty formalities. The sheriff herself seemed intimidated because the Devil's Skulls had repeatedly made it clear that if she persisted, she would face a fate worse than simply losing her badge. Having learned these details, Bridger shook his head and suggested that he meet with her in person. Perhaps together they could figure out a way forward. A few hours later, after leaving Abby with the dog and making sure everything in the house was securely locked, Martha and Bridger drove to the Chester Sheriff's office. The sheriff's office was a small red brick building that had stood the test of time, almost a symbol of the old town's resilience. But it was quiet inside, too quiet. A couple of officers were asleep on chairs, leafing through a newspaper. The sheriff was sitting in her tiny office. When she saw Martha and Bridger, she stood up and nodded pleasantly, indicating that she was aware of the veteran's arrival. Behind closed doors, they began a frank conversation. Elaine admitted that her people were undertrained and afraid of the bikers. But according to her information, the Devil's Skulls were not just a criminal gang. They seemed to be part of a larger plan. In several surrounding counties, there have already been deals in which shell companies associated with the group have bought up dozens of plots of land. Why do they need all this territory? No one knows. It could be drug trafficking or the construction of some kind of warehouse hub. But all of this clearly does not bode well for the city. The sheriff said she had recently been sabotaged by a county commissioner named Wallace. He had refused to expand police powers, thwarted requests for funding, and openly supported the Devil's Skulls, calling them investors in the future of the region. Elaine did not hide her despair, but she did not want to give up. She admitted, "If there were enough people willing to stand up for the city, we could fight them off. But we are too small, and the bikers are very well armed." Martha exchanged a glance with Bridger. They both knew that what the town was facing was more like a planned military operation, a classic expansion of the gray zone, where crime and political interests were intertwined. Bridger asked if there were any local veterans who could help. Elaine said there were plenty, but they were scattered. Many were old, and some were reluctant to get involved for fear of retaliation. People were used to thinking in terms of small-scale showdowns, not a systemic threat that could engulf the entire town. As Martha left the sheriff's office, she said in a quiet but firm voice, "We're going to protect this town, and if the bikers think they can intimidate us, that's their mistake. I grew up here, and I know how to fight for my home." Bridger backed her up with, "If they want to test us, they'll soon find out what it's like to mess with veterans who've been through more than one war." The first thing they did was contact a few other veterans Martha knew who lived nearby. They were people with different stories. Tom "Poet" Milton, a former Marine sniper who was nicknamed that for his habit of writing poetry on scraps of newspaper. Jennifer "Lynx" Wright, who had served in an elite unit and had outstanding close-quarters combat skills. And elderly Joe Roberts, a former sapper who, although he had lost a leg, remained a terror for any explosive device and a master of technical tricks. Each of them accepted the request to come to Whispering Pines, as the locals called their town, with understanding and inner readiness. Many of them had already heard about the Devil's Skulls and understood that the situation required their intervention. The group agreed to meet in a week in an old abandoned hangar near the river so that no one would notice their negotiations. Marta understood that she had to act carefully because the bikers could have connections even in the local administration, which meant that any leak of information threatened failure. Over the past few days, the atmosphere in the city has become even more tense. Several luxury SUVs with tinted windows, accompanied by motorcycles, have appeared in the center of Whispering Pines. New people, unfamiliar to everyone, have emerged from them. They were said to be from another state, and someone saw tattoos on their arms that looked like the emblems of a Mexican drug cartel. In addition, suspicious characters began hanging around the local bar, talking about some deals and cargo. Residents began to disappear from the streets in the evenings. Stores closed earlier than usual, and roaring engines could be heard at night. Many understood that this meant a show of force. Who was the boss here? But there were also those who began to see the devil skulls as an inevitable new government that they would have to come to terms with. Some entrepreneurs, faced with an offer they couldn't refuse, preferred to close their businesses and leave. Every day the city seemed to die out, filling with fear and rumors. In response to the growing threat, Martha, Bridger, and several local veterans began to prepare a secret defense plan. They decided that they needed a network of observation points. Some volunteered to watch the roads out of town, others to keep an eye on the mountain trails to spot large movements of people. They also created a signal system. If someone spotted a column of motorcyclists heading in one direction or another, they would quickly notify the others via radio. Maria Lucas, a former Air Force radio operator, brought portable radios and set up a secure channel. Soon, a small group of trained and close-knit people became an invisibly umbrella over Whispering Pines, while the bikers themselves did not even suspect that experienced eyes were watching them under the cover of night. The day before the meeting at the abandoned hangar, Martha received more bad news. The Devil's Skulls had visited an elderly former music teacher, Mr. Carson, and his wife. They lived in a cozy house with a beautiful porch overlooking pastoral meadows. The bikers demanded that Carson vacate the house within the next month. When he refused, they began smashing furniture and threatening the family until the old man got down on his knees, begging them to leave his wife alone. It was a classic scare tactic. That same night, unknown assailants smashed the windows and walls of his house, leaving a huge graffiti painted on the front. Tomorrow could be worse. Carson ended up in the hospital with a heart attack. The police, the sheriff, and the local newspaper all knew it, but almost nothing was done. What was especially depressing was that Commissioner Wallace seemed to be stalling the investigation and dragging his feet, saying that he had no solid evidence. Martha spent the night awake, a loaded shotgun next to her bed. Staring at the ceiling, she remembered South America, where civilians also lived in fear of paramilitary groups. Then she and her fellow soldiers helped villagers create self-defense. And here, everything was repeated. Collective fear, the inability of the authorities or their bribery, the loneliness of those who dared to resist. But experience told her, if you unite people, give them confidence that they are not alone, teach them to defend themselves, then even a small community is capable of resisting a seemingly invulnerable enemy. The farm that her family inherited from their ancestors was her fortress, her home, and she was not going to give it up. Martha again felt the fighting determination that had saved her life more than once in distant lands. The next day, she, Bridger, and the other veterans who could make it met at the designated location, a rusty hangar in the middle of a scorched field that had once been used to land small corn planes. Each man drove in one at a time, trying not to attract attention. It was dark inside. The windows were boarded up. The remains of lamps and wires hung overhead, and in some places the floor had caved in. The walls were covered in years of dust, but they could talk there without witnesses. Martha was surrounded by 6 people: Bridger, Tom Poet Milton, Jennifer Lynx Wright, Joe Roberts, Maria Lucas, and another man, Jerry Bear Tanner, a former survival instructor. Almost all of them were battle-hardened old men, seasoned, tough, but still with the skill and will to resist. Each person in turn shared what they had learned about the situation in and around the town. Link said that according to information from a friend at a shipping company, an unusually large number of containers of some kind of equipment had recently passed through the train station near Whispering Pines, bound, according to documents, for a company registered in a neighboring state. The people involved were the same as those in the documents associated with the Devil's Skulls group. Perhaps they were talking about weapons shipments. Joe Roberts, picking at his artificial leg, noticed an increase in the number of suspicious mini-explosions and attacks in the area. It seemed that the bikers were training to carry out sabotage or intimidation attacks. Bridger reminded them that their goal was to protect the town and the people, not to engage in open war with no chance of success. But if war did come to their doorstep, they had to be ready. The discussion lasted for several hours. Bridger formulated a plan. It was necessary to act simultaneously in 3 directions. First, to establish a local self-defense network, to train those who were ready to participate in patrols, to install alarms and cameras where possible. Second, to obtain serious evidence against the Devil's Skulls and bring them to the federal level, bypassing corrupt officials like Wallace. And third, it was necessary to undermine the financial sources of the group, finding out who helps them launder money and formally own land. At the same time, everyone unanimously decided that everything must be done secretly and quickly, so that the enemy does not have time to launch a preemptive strike. Martha was silent for most of the meeting. She listened and weighed ideas, noting each other's experiences and how they could contribute. When the conversation began to reach a conclusion, she stood up and made a short but powerful speech. "I am ready to fight, not because I like violence, but because I will not let these people destroy the home my family has paid for with blood and sweat for over a century. Wars are always dirty and scary, I know that better than most, but there are things more important than fear, and if we are destined to fight, we will fight together." There was such confidence in her words that everyone around her felt united, as if they had become parts of the same machine. Jennifer Lynx nodded briefly, and Bridger added, "We are in this together and we will not back down." When the meeting was over, everyone quietly and unnoticed left the hangar. They had agreed not to all meet in one place at once, so as not to attract attention. Martha returned home to find Abby reading old photographs from Martha's own military service. Abby's eyes were full of curiosity and respect. She knew that her grandmother had been through a lot, but she only understood it through stories. "Have you really been to the Amazon jungle?" she would sometimes ask. Martha would just nod or say, "Yes, and there I learned that a person is stronger than he thinks." Now, standing in silence by the window, she said to her granddaughter, "We are going through a hard time. You will have to be brave. But remember, you are not alone." Abby, although she felt afraid, straightened up and said, "I am with you, Grandma. I will not run away, even if they come here. This is our home." Marta looked at her with pride and quiet pain. She didn't want to expose her granddaughter to danger, but fate had its own plans. By evening, new rumors were already circulating around the area. A column of bikers was said to be arriving from out of state, reinforcements that would complete the cleanup and force all the local landowners to sell their plots. The news caused alarm. Many who were still holding out were now thinking about running. But Martha was not going to back down. She simply sent a short message to Bridger. "Here we go." And in the gathering darkness, figures appeared outside her farmhouse, helping to set up motion sensors, floodlights, and tripwires with flashbangs in case of a night attack. In that moment, she remembered all her combat deployments, when they had set up a security perimeter deep behind enemy lines. Incredibly, but now, years later, she was applying that knowledge here at home, protecting the quiet mountains where she had once sledded with her friends. That night, after the defenses were set up, no one slept. People took turns keeping watch, looking out at the distant lights of the city where anyone could come from. There was a chill in the air, but there was something else: solidarity, determination, a willingness to fight back. Somewhere in the distance, the howling of the wind mingled with the roar of engines. Martha stood on the porch, leaning against a column, and thought about all the losses she had suffered in her life. She knew that protecting those dear to you was the highest value, worth risking. Behind her, a light burned in the window, and inside, Abby and Henry the dog dozed quietly. Tomorrow would be a day when their unity would be severely tested. But she was not afraid. Her heart beat steadily, as before a difficult operation, and there was something ancient, almost mystical, in this certainty. It was as if the spirits of the mountains had truly awakened to support their defenders. The night had grown colder, and at dawn a white haze seemed to envelop the farm. Here and there a fragile frost hung from the branches of the pine trees, and the whole earth around them made a barely audible creak with every step. As soon as the wind died down, the pristine silence and majesty of the mountains came into play, as if hiding their secret life behind a fragile curtain of winter cold. But inside the house it was warm, the fireplace crackled, and the air was filled with the aroma of toast and the tea that Martha had made for herself and Abby. Despite her anxious thoughts, she had to move forward, because any delay could cost too much. From early morning there was a flurry of activity, checking the alarms that Bridger and the other veterans had installed during the night, setting up radios, gathering information about the situation in the city. One of the volunteers would call Mana, as Maria Lucas, the former radio operator, was known, reporting that another biker caravan had arrived on the outskirts of Whispering Pines. Marta would write down all the details: how many people, what kind of transport they had, where they were staying. It was clear that the group was steadily increasing its presence, and soon this caravan would turn into a real deterrent. But the fact that they were hesitating to attack openly meant that they were either waiting for the right moment or they needed some documents or resources before taking more decisive action. Perhaps they were trying to bribe the right officials or negotiate cover with influences far above the local level. By midday, Bridger was back at the farm. He parked his car in a secluded spot under the old spruce trees to avoid being seen, and walked. He brought a small group of men with him, whom he planned to distribute to different areas for surveillance and support. Among them was Jennifer Lynx Wright. With her shock of golden blonde hair, it was hard to imagine her as an elite veteran, but the woman had a keen gaze and unusually confident movements. There seemed to be a predatory grace in every step she took. She did not show any emotion, but immediately began discussing with Martha how best to fortify the access road to the farm to create a bottleneck, in case bikers or any other enemies tried to break through here in trucks. The road itself was winding, and with the right placement of obstacles, the enemy could be forced to move slowly and under fire. Marta nodded, but inside she felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if she were back in one of those forgotten hot spots. Only instead of a dirty foreign town, she was next to her home, and instead of foreign land, she was on her own farm, where she grew lavender and kept a flock of sheep. The mortal threat seemed no less real for that. By the evening of the same day, it became known that Sheriff Elaine Chester had left for an on-site inspection of the Hopkins Ranch. People from County Commissioner Wallace had arrived there for some kind of inspection of environmental standards. According to rumors, the reason for the inspection was a formal violation of livestock regulations. The Hopkins claimed that this was a far-fetched pretext, and in fact, the commissioner simply wanted to force them to sell the land to investors. When Bridger told Martha about this, she frowned. It became clear to her that Wallace was acting systematically, using his administrative resources to put pressure on uncooperative farmers. With each such step, the devil's skulls penetrated the structure of the town more and more, buying out and intimidating everyone who could resist. But if the sheriff was under crossfire from the commissioner, her hands were practically tied. At sunset, Martha went for a walk around the farm, giving herself a break from planning. In places like this, any storms, natural and human, felt stronger than in the city. She wanted to breathe in the frosty air and feel a connection to the land. As she walked through the pasture, Jennifer caught up with her, radiating focused excitement. Lynx told her that she had learned something about the leader of the Devil's Skulls, Marcus Holt, through reliable channels. It turned out that he was more than just a vulgar biker. In his youth, he served in the army, but was discharged for disobeying orders and fighting. Then he went down the criminal path and managed to put together a network in different states, receiving support from cartels. There is reason to believe that Holt knows how to plan military operations on a small scale, knows tactics, and stays afloat due to various dirty contacts. Hearing this, Martha realized that she should not underestimate him. She asked Lynx to continue gathering information. Perhaps there was something else that would allow her to understand the weaknesses of Holt and his people. The night turned out to be restless. Closer to 2 o'clock in the morning, Martha heard the distant roar of several motorcycles. The farm was at a decent distance from the center of Whispering Pines, but now the sounds of the motor columns began to be heard more clearly and more often, as if the bikers were deliberately cruising the highway, reminding who was the master of the roads here. Abby, awakened by the noise, appeared in the kitchen, looked at her grandmother with worried eyes, but did not say a word, seeing that Martha was holding herself upright and her gaze indicated readiness for any surprises. Lynx, who was replacing Bridger on duty, quietly whispered that the observers noticed. Some of the bikers went back outside the city and some went to the area where Mr. Carson lived. Apparently, the Devil's Skulls continued to terrorize his family, trying to finally squeeze them out of the area. Marta felt a sinking feeling inside. She wanted to rush to the rescue, but she knew she had to act carefully. It was one thing to lose her temper, but another to effectively confront well-armed bandits who could use innocent people as hostages. An hour later, word came. 2 volunteers patrolling Carson's neighborhood noticed flashes in the window of his house and heard screams. A few minutes later, 2 cars with bright headlights sped past them. Luckily, the sheriff's police car arrived on the scene immediately after, and according to our observers, there were signs of a struggle inside the house, a broken door, but no one seemed to be dead. Carson's wife, however, was missing. It later turned out that she had been taken by unknown persons, either as a hostage or as a new target for blackmail. Suspicion fell on Holt and his men, but there was no direct evidence. The sheriff immediately announced a search, which only caused ridicule from the bikers who rode around the city in groups and openly said that the laws do not apply here. The veterans, having learned all this, understood. The situation was spinning faster and faster. If active steps were not taken, the city would plunge into chaos. Over the next day, the veterans, joined by several locals, began to form 2 mobile groups, one for patrols in cars, the other for foot patrols that could arrive at key points in minutes if necessary. Thus, Marta's old house was transformed into a kind of headquarters, where radios, maps, and even some weapons, obtained legally and registered, were carefully stored. Marta's age and her inconspicuous status as a villager helped to hide the scale of what was happening from prying eyes. While the Devil's Skulls believed that they were dealing only with lonely farmers, they secretly deployed good preparations for defense. A few days later, as the sun was setting, heavy pickup trucks with closed beds began to arrive in the city. According to informants, the drivers were clearly of Latin American descent, with an accent and the corresponding mannerisms. They were probably representatives or mercenaries of some drug cartel associated with Holt. Everything pointed to the fact that the stakes were being raised. The Devil's Skulls had a direct connection with international criminal structures, and now it was not just about buying up land, but about something more global. Some believed that secret warehouses or laboratories were going to be built on these territories. Others suspected that a large smuggling route would go through this quiet mountain region. In any case, the appearance of such guests did not promise anything good for the locals. The veterans and their sympathizers decided to hold an emergency meeting in an informal format at the home of Bill Martin, another veteran who lived just outside the city limits. His house was large and located in a low spot, so it was almost invisible from the road. People came there individually, on foot or in small groups, so as not to attract attention. Among those gathered were not only retired military personnel, but also several young people, hunters, farmers, mechanics, all who could not stand by and watch crime spread across their land. In all, about 24 people gathered. After brief greetings and a cautious exchange of rumors, Bridger took the floor. He understood that a clear plan was needed that the majority would agree with. Otherwise, amateurish action would only lead to casualties. Bridger laid out a plan. First, it was necessary to collect evidence against the Devil's Skulls and their patrons, make copies and send them to several federal agencies so that the criminals would not be able to hush up the case at the local level. Second, it was necessary to strengthen the local police with people who could be trusted. Under pressure from the sheriff, and if possible, bypassing Commissioner Wallace, additional assistants could be temporarily officially appointed from among local residents. This would give their actions legitimacy. Finally, third, it was important to create hidden defense reserves, in case the state law enforcement officers were bought off or an order came from above to disarm the locals. For this purpose, it was planned to hide some of the weapons and ammunition in safe places, known only to a limited circle. However, many doubted that the sheriff would agree to such measures. They were too serious and could be considered illegal. Then Jennifer Lynx Wright took the floor. She said that she had already met with Elaine Chester alone, and she made it clear that, in fact, she approves of any legal action aimed at protecting people. but the sheriff was afraid to speak about it openly because of pressure from above. Links emphasized that Chester is an honest woman, but her options are limited. If given evidence, testimony, and community support, she is capable of taking risks. Many were skeptical that someone in the legal system would play on their side, but decided to consider this option. The conversation lasted until late at night. People left quietly, trying not to talk on the streets and leaving Bill's house in small groups. After all, everyone understood that the Devil's Skulls had their informants who could monitor any large gatherings. Martha was one of the last to leave. She was uneasy because the decision they had made meant taking a risk. Their small, self-organized defense could attract too much attention and cause a powerful response. And when crime feels threatened, it stops taking half measures and switches to the most brutal tactics. Sometimes this meant disappearances, kidnappings, and murders. Martha knew this handwriting all too well. On the other hand, there was no time to waste. The following days were filled with alarming events again. At the same time as the cartel machines arrived in the city, the inspections from the district commissioner sharply intensified. The deadline for tax payments for farmers was approaching, and many received notices of a revision of cadastral value. In fact, taxes were skyrocketing, and if people could not pay immediately, they were threatened with confiscation of property. It was an obvious scheme. On the one hand, farmers were strangled with taxes, and on the other, the Devil's Skulls offered a good deal to sell the land and leave. This is how the silent squeeze is carried out. And for those who are afraid of poverty or late payments, the offer increasingly seems, albeit bad, but the only possible option. The blow fell especially hard on the elderly, who barely made ends meet, running small farms. Some had no strength left to fight, and they gave in, signed papers, and went to live with their children in other states. Rumors began to spread in the city that several farms, once prosperous, had already been bought by a shell company connected to Holt. People found out about this by seeing fences, guards, and the familiar emblems of the Devil's Skulls suddenly appear on the territory of the former owners. No one doubted any more that a systematic and sinister operation was underway, the goal of which was not just to terrorize the residents, but to take control of the entire area. Martha's farm was also visited by inspectors from the commissioner's office, supposedly to check for compliance with fire safety regulations. They were accompanied by a local policeman whom Martha had never seen before, and he was acting too brazenly, examining every corner of the house. When Martha asked if he had a warrant for such an inspection, he only grinned and waved some document with a seal. If this had happened to anyone else, the house would have been searched by now. However, the presence of Bridger and Jennifer, who were quietly observing the visitors, cooled the ardor of the newcomers. The inspectors limited themselves to a formal inspection of the barn, recorded non-existent violations, drew up a report, and left. But their strange grin made it clear that this was only the beginning. Martha had to understand who was supposedly in charge here, and sooner or later give in. That evening, Martha received a call from Sheriff Chester. Elaine sounded tense and said she couldn't speak openly, but she advised Martha to be very careful with her paperwork and deny attending any meetings. Martha guessed that the sheriff was trying to warn her. Commissioner Wallace was probably initiating a review and monitoring of phone calls in the county to identify subversive activities against the new investors. The sheriff was trying to help the townspeople quietly, but she was in a delicate situation herself. Martha thanked her, knowing the price Chester was paying, risking his career and perhaps even his life. It was hard to uphold the law when the law itself was crippled by corruption. The whole thing with the audits and the front companies made the veterans think they needed to reach a higher level than just the state police. If they could get the materials to the FBI or another federal agency where county corruption didn't carry much weight, there would be a chance for an official investigation. But that would require hard evidence, not rumors and suspicions. Bridger and Links devised a plan, set up surveillance at one of the warehouses where the bikers unloaded boxes from their trucks at night. It was important to film or record what was inside the boxes to see if officials were involved. Maybe they could follow the logistics and find out where the cargo was going. Soon, two young guys, former hunters, agreed to help with surveillance. They had drones with a night camera and a decent flight range. True, they bought these devices out of interest in nature, but now the equipment had to be used for another purpose. With the help of drones and radio equipment, it was possible to film the warehouse and the adjacent territory from above. The veterans understood that this was a dangerous operation. The cartel and bikers probably had insurance and could immediately open fire if they noticed that they were being filmed, but there was no other way to collect evidence. While preparations for this operation were underway, life in the city flowed slowly along, overlaid with the horror that was so familiar to Marta from her previous combat experience. Fear permeated with everyday life. People tried to go about their daily lives, buy groceries, do housework, take their children to school, but at the same time they constantly looked around and thought, "Will they come to me tonight? Or, will they set my barn on fire?" In the diner, where life was always in full swing, bikers now sat, looking into the faces of the customers with ominous squints. Some locals became cautious, almost sullen, while others, as they say, bent over and began to try to please the gang, hoping to survive, even at the cost of betraying their neighbors. One evening, as Martha sat at the kitchen table, planning her upcoming reconnaissance mission, an unmarked car pulled up to the house. Its headlights illuminated the gravel driveway. The men did not act like intruders. They got out of the car slowly, turning on the interior lights to show that they were not hiding. Martha became wary and readied her shotgun, asking Abby to take cover in the back room. She stepped out onto the porch. Before her stood a stocky man and a young woman wearing faded badges that bore the insignia of the State Security Service. The man held his hand slightly out of sight, demonstrating that he was unarmed. A strange conversation ensued. They introduced themselves as employees of a private agency, supposedly hired by the county to provide security for strategic installations. Martha, listening to this formulation, became increasingly convinced that this was another scheme. The man's eyes were hard, confident, the typical look of a seasoned operative, perhaps with military training. The one standing next to him seemed younger, but her eyes also spoke of danger. They claimed to be conducting an emergency preparedness check and had received the appropriate permission from Commissioner Wallace. They mentioned her name with an obvious aim to elicit submissive compliance from Martha, but she only smirked coldly. When they asked to inspect the house and barns, she demanded a warrant. The man pulled out a paper and said, "This is a mere formality, madam. I hope you are not setting a precedent. We simply want to make sure that there are no illegal structures on your property that pose a threat to public safety." Martha replied dryly that she had never heard of anything like that, and if they wanted to inspect anything, they should come with the sheriff. The man, smiling, said that Sheriff Chester had been notified but was busy, and told the employee to go around the house to the right. At this point, Bridger, who had been standing at a distance, intervened and calmly said that, under state law, outside agencies could not search private property without the presence of either the owner or official police officers with a court order. The paper they had produced was essentially a blank. The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze sliding over Bridger. For a moment, there was tension, and it seemed as if a shootout might occur. But then Jennifer Lynx appeared on the porch, armed with a rifle, although she did not point it directly, but she looked convincing enough. In this situation, the private security guards realized that this farm was not a defenseless place. They exchanged glances, and the man said through gritted teeth, "We do not want a conflict. We are simply carrying out the commissioner's orders." Bridger replied that they too were doing their civic duty. As a result, the couple wrapped up the inspection and left, loudly barking something in farewell about stupid stubbornness and consequences. Abby watched this episode closely from the window. When the car was out of sight, she came out of the house, approached her grandmother, and asked quietly, "They'll come back, right?" Martha leaned toward her granddaughter, nodded, and gently ran her hand through her hair. "Maybe, but we'll be ready." The girl hugged her grandmother tightly for a moment and then ran into the house, as if trying to hide her tears. This brief episode showed once again how threatening the situation had become. But it also revealed that even without obvious superiority, it is possible to resist if you firmly stand up for your rights and do not give in to intimidation. Soon, under the cover of another night, a reconnaissance operation using drones began. Two young guys, Mike and David, drove a pickup truck to a slope that overlooked the warehouse where the Devil's Skulls so often loaded and unloaded their vans. They were joined by Tom Poet Milton, a former sniper who was excellent at calculating distances and finding hidden places for observation. They took the drone to an altitude that allowed them to remain unnoticed in the semi-darkness. The veterans tuned into the radio channel, listening to the conversations. The warehouse was located in a former grain silo next to an abandoned railway line. Officially, the warehouse belonged to a company called Golden Grains, but locals had long said that the company only existed on paper. For an hour, the drone hovered above the object, recording everything that was happening on a camera with a thermal imager. Observers saw people in devil's skull leather jackets meeting several cars loaded with boxes. The cars had no numbers, another telling detail. They unloaded something from the boxes and dragged it inside, then loaded something back. Having completed the operation, the cars drove off towards the mountain roads. But the most important thing that was captured was the presence of Commissioner Wallace. He arrived accompanied by 2 alleged assistants and entered the warehouse himself. The video clearly shows Wallace shaking hands with one of the bikers, after which the latter apparently hands him a briefcase, and the commissioner quickly glances around and disappears into the shadows of the warehouse. The recording was not perfect, but faces can be made out, and this is already a strong piece of evidence. The thermal imager clearly showed Wallace's silhouette, which fell into the field of view. And although some moments remained blurry, proving the presence of a high-ranking official in the lair of a criminal group with which he technically should not have dealings was already a big help. It could attract the attention of at least some federal agents if the recordings were used wisely. The team knew this footage was key to their next move. The question was how to safely and correctly transfer it without revealing the source or exposing the drone operators to persecution. After returning from the shoot, Mike and David handed the flash drive to Marta and Bridger. They made several copies, just in case. On one copy, they marked the files with the dates and times of the shooting to maintain legal validity. On another, they removed the metadata so that a cleaner version could be transmitted. Then Marta contacted Jennifer and asked her to find a contact at the FBI, perhaps through veterans or former colleagues. Someone Jennifer knew seemed to work in Washington and could help get the recordings into safe hands. While the veterans were deciding what to do, another tragic piece of news came to light. Mr. Carson, whose wife had been kidnapped, received a call from an unknown person saying that she was still alive, but that could change. He was required to transfer his house and land to new owners, or his wife would disappear within a week. Such open cruelty caused a real shock in the city. Fewer and fewer people retained hope for legal means, and calls to drive out the bandits, even with pitchforks and guns, were heard more and more often. On the other hand, families who had no resources left surrendered because they feared for their own lives. The atmosphere became explosive. Everyone felt that if decisive measures were not taken, the number of victims would only increase around them. But Martha knew it wasn't enough to just show the footage. They needed to organize a synchronized action so that when their cards were exposed, neither Commissioner Wallace nor the bikers could retreat and cover their tracks or turn the tables. And they certainly wouldn't have time to take revenge on the locals. Bridger suggested that they could simultaneously conduct a fear campaign against the gang itself. For example, at night, when they gathered in a bar, make it so that someone clearly demonstrated that their movements were being monitored, that they did not have complete dominance. But Martha was against provocation for the sake of provocation. She believed that any action should be thought out and serve the main goal, to undermine the criminal network and give law enforcement, those who had not yet been sold, the opportunity to intervene. Late that evening, Bridger's phone rang. Jennifer. She said that an FBI contact was willing to take the materials, but he had only a short window of opportunity, and that the evidence had to be delivered in person to a designated location within 24 hours. That meant someone would have to leave Montana and cross state lines as quietly and unnoticed as possible. Preferably, they would have to park their car somewhere far away to avoid surveillance. Bridger couldn't leave himself. He had to coordinate the defense in Martha's absence. Lynx was needed here too. Then Martha said, "I'll go. I'm the one who has to deliver these tapes. You stay here and take charge of the farm and cover my rear. I have some old connections that might help us slip through undetected." Her decision was firm. There was no point in competing with that tone. They spent the entire night preparing for the trip. They made fake license plates, checked the car, packed the luggage, sewed a secret pocket in the seat where they could hide flash drives. Some of the group didn't sleep, knowing how risky it was to send Marta alone to another state. But there were no options. Someone on the team had to find evidence, and it seemed that Marta was the best candidate. She knew from experience how to bypass checkpoints, how to recognize surveillance. And besides, having merits and age, she could arouse less suspicion than young veterans with obvious military bearing. By morning, everything was ready. The farewell to Abby was restrained, but filled with tenderness. The girl understood that her grandmother was risking her life, but she tried not to show her feelings. She approached the car, took Martha's hand, and said, "I know you'll come back, because this is your home, and you can't leave us." Martha smiled, squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "I'll come back. Just don't forget to stay close to Lynx and don't go into town alone. Take care of yourself and our home." They hugged, and at that moment Henry the dog, as if sensing anxiety, began to bark excitedly. A moment later, Martha started the engine and drove out of the yard, stroking the steering wheel to stop her hands from shaking. Ahead of her lay a path through passes and highways patrolled by state police, some sections of which were clearly already corrupt or bought by the gang. She had to drive extremely carefully, without raising the slightest suspicion. But the hardest part was still ahead. Outside of Montana, at an agreed-upon location, she was to be met by a man from the FBI, ready to take the dirt and, perhaps, pass it on. Martha didn't know how much she could trust him, but they had no choice. At least if everything went according to plan, records of Wallace's and the Devil's Skull's illegal dealings would end up on the desks of federal agents. As the car disappeared around the bend, Bridger and Lynx exchanged a few quick words and began distributing men to posts, preparing for possible attacks. Without Martha, the farm was more vulnerable, because she was the leader everyone turned to for advice. But now they would have to be strong themselves. Against the heavy sky and cold wind, their figures resembled stone statues guarding the fortress from intruders. Somewhere deep inside, each of them knew that if something happened to Martha on the way, their plan would collapse and the town would be defenseless. So all that was left was to rely on her experience and luck. There were still several hours until dawn, and darkness enveloped the already gloomy mountains. The occasional lights of villages flickered on the horizon, and a little closer one could discern the dull light of lanterns burning near the very warehouse where suspicious cargo was being transported. Perhaps at that moment some business was already being conducted inside the warehouse. Deals were being made. Perhaps Commissioner Wallace was standing nearby, sorting out issues of how to cover up the next stage of the machinations. Or perhaps Marcus Holt himself was busy with the planning, figuring out how many people this town would need to be scared with so that they would fall to their knees. But in the blackness of the night, a quiet determination smoldered, reinforced by experience and faith in justice. The city was no longer completely helpless. Many remembered Martha's words about the strength of society being in unity. And those who had already decided to resist were not going to turn from this path. Time will tell how strong the bonds of solidarity are, and whether they have enough courage to face the real storm that seemed to be just around the corner. Martha drove along a dirt road that went deep into the gorge, trying to stay as far away from the main highways as possible. The car was old but reliable, with the same battered body and engine sounds that reminded of the long years it had been hauling trailers of hay and fuel. In the trunk, under a layer of bags and tools, lay a bag with documents and flash drives. A few half-rotten boards were carefully scattered over all this, so that a casual glance would not suspect something more in the ordinary farmer's luggage. Martha kept glancing in the mirror, afraid that she might be followed, although the road was empty for many miles ahead. The silence of the rocks pressed on her consciousness, and only from time to time it was interrupted by ominous gusts of wind throwing snow at the windshield. Thinking about what was happening at the farm now, Martha couldn't help but grip the steering wheel tighter, imagining Bridger, Lynx, the young guys with drones, and half a dozen local veterans doing everything they could to keep Whispering Pines safe. She was worried about her granddaughter, left in the middle of danger, but there was no choice. At this moment, it was Martha who had to deliver evidence to whoever might be able to launch a federal investigation. If everything worked out, a commission from Washington would come to town with search warrants, and then the Devil's Skulls and their patron, Commissioner Wallace, would hardly be able to hide behind corrupt schemes. In the meantime, There was one road, one chance. Around the next bend, a long bridge over a creek opened up. The planks on the bridge were icy, and the car was shaking violently. Martha drove slowly and carefully. As she passed, she saw the red lights of a small checkpoint at the other end of the road, which apparently belonged to the local state police. She had to brake. There was a stop sign and a barrier ahead, and a patrol car was flashing nearby. There was usually no one here, if you don't count the seasonal checkpoint on rare days when the road was closed due to weather conditions. But now the weather, although cold, was not critical. Why were the police here then? Marta approached slowly, rolling down the side window. A serious-looking man got out of the patrol car. His uniform had emblems on it, and his last name was Grant. He asked to see her documents. Marta did not object, realizing that rebelling now meant drawing unnecessary attention to herself. Grant shone a flashlight in her face, looking at her driver's license with distrust. She noticed that there was a second person sitting next to her in the car who was clearly keeping a close eye on the situation. Grant returned the documents and asked where she was going. Marta answered in an even tone that she was going to see a cousin in the neighboring county who had health problems. The patrolman looked at her face for a long time, then quietly said, "Be careful on the slopes. There is ice there." And he lowered the barrier. Marta drove on, trying not to betray her inner tension. She thought she saw something suspicious in Grant's eyes, as if he had been instructed to check everyone leaving the county now. But perhaps that was just paranoia. Either way, she passed the checkpoint without incident. That night, she stopped at a small roadside motel, locking herself in the room with a bolt and placing a short-barreled shotgun next to her bed. She managed to doze fitfully through constant tension and thoughts about whether the veterans in the city had managed to remain calm and not provoke the devil's skulls. Early in the morning, Martha set out again, avoiding the main roads. The road sometimes wound through pine forests, sometimes led out onto deserted plains. Somewhere along the way, she had to stop when a small bumper shield fell off. She quickly screwed it back on with wire. Papers and flash drives rustled in her bag, and in her soul, despite the cold, new hope was awakening. Perhaps they really could change the course of events. Meanwhile, Whispering Pines was going through its own twists and turns. The Devil's Skulls had gathered for the evening at a diner on the outskirts of town that they had effectively turned into their headquarters, forcing the owner to pay rent for the privilege of remaining there. Loud music was blasting inside, and motorcycles and cars without license plates were milling about in the parking lot. Half a dozen bikers were sitting at the counter, talking in low voices. Among them was Marcus Holt himself, who seemed to be enjoying his growing influence. He occasionally glanced at his watch, apparently expecting someone important. In the evening, a black SUV pulled up, and two Hispanic-looking men got out. One had an eagle tattoo on his arm, and the other had a necklace with some kind of animal fang. They were clearly armed, and they weren't particularly hiding their weapons. Entering the diner, they walked straight up to Holt and with a slight nod threw a folder on his table. At that moment, Sheriff Chester was driving by in her patrol SUV. She saw that there was an abnormally large amount of traffic outside the diner and decided to pop in to check out the situation. As she entered, she felt a wave of hostile silence. The music died down, and the bikers stared at her. Holt bowed his head slightly and smirked. Chester knew that she couldn't do anything alone, but she showed that she wasn't afraid by walking up to the bar and asking the owner if everything was okay. There was no answer. The owner just silently lowered his eyes. Tension hung in the air, and the Latinos continued to stare at the sheriff with an unkind squint. Realizing that she could provoke a conflict, Chester decided to limit herself to a formal presence. She said that she received a noise complaint and asked them not to exceed the permissible volume level. The bikers listened to her with boredom, not showing open aggression, but not showing the slightest respect either. Holt moved from his seat, walked so close to the sheriff that she could smell his leather jacket and tobacco, and said in a half-whisper, "You need to stop poking your nose into things that don't belong here, Elaine. It's only a little bit longer, and this place will be ours." Chester clenched her fists, held his gaze silently, then turned and walked toward the exit. There were chuckles and mocking comments from behind her, but she only clenched her jaw, feeling her temples throbbing. Now was not the time to be asking for trouble when there was a whole gang to confront on her own. Half an hour later, already at the station, Chester received a call. Someone had seen a group of unknown people with guns near the old school. The sheriff went out on the call, deciding that this was another appearance of bikers. But upon arrival, she found a different picture. In the depths of the yard stood a man well known to her by name, Stanley Thorne, assistant to the county commissioner Wallace. He was unloading something from the trunk of his car and transferring it to a small truck. Several strong guys were hanging around him, looking at the sheriff's patrol car that had arrived with obvious mistrust. Thorne, seeing Chester, took a piece of paper with stacks of invoices and dryly said that he was engaged in inventorying county property. The sheriff knew that any attempt to interrogate Thorne now could lead to a conflict, given that all administrative resources were on Wallace's side. But it was extremely unpleasant for her to see how the government that was supposed to protect the city was actually helping criminals operate under the guise of investments and property control. Thorne offered to let the sheriff look at the papers, but he smiled demonstratively, realizing that Chester had no real authority to stop it. An hour later, across town, at the old barn where the veterans were gathering, there was a quiet stir. Bridger called in everyone who had been on unofficial patrols and asked for a status report. First of all, it turned out that a couple of people in his circle had seen several cars with security logos driving along the farm roads during the night, questioning locals about the events, about the placement of cameras. Essentially, they were hunting for any sign of resistance. In addition, information had emerged that Holt and the cartel's men had begun searching for a key witness. Perhaps this was a person with incriminating information against the commissioner. It became clear that the Devil Skulls were looking for any leads to eliminate the threat to their plans. Links shared rumors that a familiar cartel killer nicknamed Lobo had been spotted in the city. He had become famous in the southern regions for his skill in identifying and eliminating undesirables without leaving a trace. His appearance meant that the situation could take a turn for the worst. Bridger sighed. So, if they really did use such specialists, it's serious. We need to be extremely careful. The veterans exchanged glances. Many of them had the realization in their eyes that this was no longer just a dispute with bikers, but a full-fledged confrontation with an international criminal network. And they had only a small core of trained people and a couple dozen residents ready to take up arms. But there was still hope for Marta. Everyone was waiting for news from her. Had she been able to hand over the materials? Was she even alive? According to the plan, Marta was supposed to return no later than 3 days later, if all went well. So far, it was only 1.5. Bridger suggested increasing surveillance at the approaches to the city and moving the watch closer to nightfall. Now, when more and more outsiders were arriving in the city, it was extremely important to know who, when, and where they were coming from. Many locals tried to stay away, but they still watched what was happening, and from time to time passed information to Lynx or other veterans. There was a sense of caution in this resistance clan, because people understood that the slightest leak of information could cost their lives. But some farmers said that it was better to take a risk now than to lose everything completely. For Bridger and his team, this was an important sign. People's fear was gradually turning into determination. At Martha's farm, where Abby stayed, they had prepared small caches in the root cellar. Joe Roberts, a veteran bomb disposal expert, helped camouflage the entrance using old boards and tarps to make it look like ordinary farm debris. It would provide cover in case of a surprise attack and a place to hold out for a while until reinforcements arrived. Abby helped by passing tools, although she tried to look cheerful. But in the evenings, her face reflected anxiety, and everyone noticed it. She had only one request for the adults. Please don't spill blood in our yard if you can avoid it. Lynx, biting her lip, admitted to the girl that no one here wanted to kill. But when it came to protecting home and family, sometimes there was no peaceful solution. Meanwhile, in a large city outside the state, Martha finally found the old diner where she was supposed to make contact with the FBI agent. The journey had taken her a day longer than planned due to the detours she had to take. She was exhausted, but she kept herself going with black coffee and the thought that she was about to hand over important evidence. The diner was typical, with neon signs and the smell of fried food that wafted from the door. Martha put on a dark jacket and hat, trying not to attract attention. Looking around, she saw a man in a plaid shirt at one of the tables, pretending to read a newspaper, although his eyes kept sliding around the room. She approached him and asked if a seat was available. He nodded and introduced himself as Dan. Martha realized that this was her contact. The conversation was hushed. Dan, he said, worked in a regional office for the FBI. He wasn't officially authorized to take this kind of material, but he had the opportunity to pass it on to someone who had real clout in corruption and organized crime investigations. Drug cartels and money laundering were areas of focus for a number of federal agencies, and if the big guys got involved, the devil's skulls would be in trouble. But they'd need more than a recording of the commissioner accepting a case of cash, though that was a good start. Dan asked if Martha had anything else. She gave him a rundown of the situation, threats of violence, the kidnapping of Mr. Carson's wife, the burning of farms. All serious stuff to be sure, but without hard evidence it would be hard to move against the politically connected. Martha put a flash drive on the table, saying that it contained video footage, including drone footage from the warehouse. She mentioned that she also had photos of receipts, land sales documents written out to shell companies, and farmers' testimonies. Dan took the flash drive, looked at Martha carefully, and said, "Do you realize that your life and the lives of everyone involved in this story are at stake? If everything you're telling us is true, the cartel could respond immediately. They'll need to arrange witness protection, maybe even evacuate some people." Martha shook her head. "They're not leaving town. This is their home, and they're ready to defend it." The FBI agent said nothing, just sighed, and said he'd do everything he could to get the case moving. But he warned, "If your opponents have political connections, the process could stall. An official request for arrests could take weeks at best. At worst, everything could go silent. But I have a friend who is leading a major case against one of the drug networks. Perhaps we can connect the dots." Martha knew she wasn't guaranteed a full solution here, but this step was vital. Handing over the data felt like a huge weight had been lifted. She gave Dan the veterans' phone numbers and call signs to contact them. He asked her to stay in touch, but to avoid direct calls if possible. After that, they parted. It was already midnight outside. Martha got into her car, replaying the entire meeting in her head, wondering if she could trust Dan. She didn't know. But if she couldn't trust him, then who? She planned to return to Whispering Pines by a slightly different route, to confuse possible surveillance. As Martha headed back, the mountain town had another nasty night. Around midnight, a worried voice came over the radio, reporting flashes and gunshots near Mr. Hopkins' farm. 2 Devil's Skulls cars pulled up, and they seemed to be acting very aggressively. Bridger and 3 other veterans rode out to help, carrying guns and body armor. As they approached the farm, they saw a burning barn and a car that had crashed into a pole. Figures flickered in the headlights, openly brandishing weapons. Bridger realized that a fight had broken out, and that Hopkins or whoever was at his house was desperately fighting back. The veterans turned on their headlights and raced to the property, but the bikers, hearing the noise, quickly regrouped. A brief firefight ensued, bullets bouncing off bumpers and piercing the bodywork. Bridger hoped in his heart that none of their men had died. There were probably about 8 bikers. When the veterans appeared, they retreated around the corner of the barn for a moment, then, noticing their numerical equality, moved to counterattack. One of them threw a Molotov cocktail toward the old car, trying to cut off the veterans' escape. To prevent the fire from spreading and getting burned, Bridger ordered his men to disperse. He shouted to 2 of the patrol guys to try to flank the barn and force the attackers to lie down. However, the situation became more complicated when new headlights suddenly appeared. Another pickup truck had pulled up to help the bikers. There were 3 people armed with automatic weapons in it. Now the advantage was clearly on the gang's side. Bridger realized that the risk of death was extremely high. He managed to shout to Lynx into the radio to signal the sheriff about the armed attack. But until help arrived, and would it even arrive, something had to be done. Hopkins, hiding in his house, was also shooting, judging by the pops and flashes, but he probably did not have enough ammunition. Bridger figured that he needed to buy time and make the bikers think that they were up against a large force. Various stratagems were used. One of the veterans, Jerry Bear Tanner, tossed a homemade flashbang grenade around the corner of the barn. It made a loud bang, blinding the attackers for a few seconds. At that moment, Bridger and another veteran fired a series of short shots into the air and ground to create the impression of a massed gunfire. The bikers were obviously not prepared for this tactic. They dropped to the ground and, cursing, retreated toward the pickup. This gave them time to get Hopkins and his 2 employees out of the house. They ran outside, jumped the fence, and took cover behind the veteran's car. Their eyes were shocked, but they were unharmed. One of the bullets apparently grazed Hopkins's shoulder, nearly knocking him unconscious. Bridger began treating the wound on the spot, pressing gauze soaked in antiseptic. Meanwhile, Lynx reported on the radio that the sheriff was already on her way, but would not get to Hopkins anytime soon, and the city police were not eager to help. The bikers, realizing that their intimidation had not had the full effect, regrouped and began to advance again. The wind was driving black clouds of smoke from the burning barn. Visibility was low. The streetlights dimly illuminated the driveway. At one point, Bridger noticed 2 shadows crawling between the bushes. The enemy was trying to get behind them. He signaled the rest of the veterans to disperse. One lay down near an overturned cart, the other behind the stonework. A moment later, several shots rang out. One of the bullets whistled literally an inch from Bridger's head. He cursed under his breath, pressing himself to the ground. And in his soul, a long-forgotten feeling of battle flared up, adrenaline when life is at stake, and every second's miss could be the last. The fight lasted perhaps 10 minutes, which seemed like an eternity. At some point, the bikers apparently ran out of incendiary mixtures and were unable to start a full-scale fire. However, one of them shot out the tires of the veteran's SUV, and Bridger realized that this had hampered their mobility. It seemed that at any moment they would find themselves in a hopeless situation. But suddenly a siren blared. Sheriff Chester's patrol SUV pulled up to the scene, followed by another one belonging to a couple of deputies. The flashing lights and a loud voice over the speaker stunned the attackers. The bikers realized that official reinforcements had arrived. Perhaps more forces would soon be arriving. At that moment, their leader, who was standing closer to the road, called a retreat, and they, after firing a few last shots, jumped into their vehicles and sped away down the dirt road, leaving behind burning wreckage and tire tracks. The veterans caught their breath. Sheriff Chester got out of the car and looked around. The house was partially damaged, the barn was on fire, there were shell casings on the ground, and the anger and fear in the eyes of the injured people. She ordered her deputies to call an ambulance for Hopkins, and then walked over to Bridger, who was helping bandage another farm worker. Their eyes met, and there was a silent understanding in them. The sheriff was alone and out of strength, and the veterans were essentially waging their own war for the town. Chester whispered, "I'm trying to follow the law, but they're giving me no chance. Commissioner Wallace is probably going to try to hush this up." Bridger wiped the sweat from his brow and said he was willing to testify about the attack and bring in witnesses. The sheriff nodded. "Let's get this formally done." But her voice already carried the same sense of doom that many of the townspeople felt. An hour later, with the fire more or less out and Hopkins in the ambulance, Chester was reporting to the station. From the conversation, the dispatcher had been ordered to take a statement, but not to launch a serious investigation until special notice. The sheriff was no longer surprised. Bridger, overhearing part of this dialogue, suggested, "What if we find those guys who set the farm on fire? Maybe one of them dropped something that could identify them?" He could hardly contain his irritation, remembering the face of one of the attackers, where the fire of cruelty burned. Chester shook her head. "If you want to look, look. But you understand that they will probably go outside the city limits or to their lair. And we need a warrant. And the chances of catching them red-handed are almost zero." She looked sympathetically at Bridger, as if apologizing for his helplessness. He realized that there was no point in blaming her, because the whole system around him was rotten. That same night, an explosion was heard on the edge of town. A dilapidated barn caught fire on the outskirts, but no one knew what kind of place it was or who it belonged to. In the morning, it turned out that they had been storing equipment and building materials there for some time, but in fact, the premises had long been empty. Conflicting rumors began to spread. Some said it was a mistake. The bikers had confused the barn and wanted to cause damage to some other place. Others claimed that it was a vengeful attack on the remaining farmers. Someone else believed that it was an attempt to intimidate the sheriff. But the very fact that explosions in the city had become a reality indicated that the level of violence was rising with every minute. The next morning, there was another meeting at Bill Martin's house. The veterans gathered to discuss the results of the night's battle and further strategy. Lynx was excited. Anger was felt in her movements. She said that it was necessary to begin a counteroffensive, to use the accumulated evidence, ambushes, to undermine the gang's weapons transportation. Bridger tried to reason with her, reminding her that they were not a formal police force and that open warfare with the cartel could lead to disaster. But Lynx was stubborn. "We are already at war. Either we strike or we will be destroyed." Jerry Bear admitted that, having seen the brutality of those who attacked the Hopkins farm, he began to lean toward the same conclusion. It would not be possible to sit on the defensive for long. More decisive actions were needed before people lost faith. In the end, they decided that a serious operation needed the green light from Martha, who promised to return with some kind of answer from the federal structures. While she was gone, they would strengthen their positions, collect more data, and help the locals, protecting them from new attacks. In addition, they agreed to work out a plan to free Mr. Carson's wife, if only they could find out where she was being held. This part was especially worrying for everyone, because it was about saving an innocent person who was being used as a tool by the bandits. According to some rumors, she could have been taken to a neighboring ranch, which was now controlled by the Devil's Skulls. However, breaking in there without intelligence meant exposing their lives to bullets. The days passed. A state of uneasy stability settled over the city. The bikers and their allies continued to grow in power, and the veterans continued to expand their underground. Occasionally, some of the defenders would make small forays. They would damage the tires of bikers' cars, set up false detour signs on the roads to reroute convoys of goods. All this irritated Holt, but he did not undertake large-scale reprisals yet. Perhaps he was waiting for orders from higher-ups, or hoping that everything would soon be sorted out through political deals. Commissioner Wallace continued his line, trying to force farmers to sell their lands with excessive taxes and nitpicking. A few families left, but many remained, stubbornly refusing to leave their homelands. When Martha finally drove up to her native mountains a few days later, her heart sank at the sight of faint black smoke rising from some of the yards on the outskirts. It seemed as if the entire county had turned into a battlefield during her absence. As she returned, she kept glancing back to make sure she was not being followed. After many detours and checks, she turned off the main road and headed toward the house along a rough path. Her heart pounded when she saw the house intact. Everything looked fine from the outside. Jumping out of the driver's seat, she felt fatigue wash over her with incredible force, and at the same time, joy. She was home again and saw Abby on the porch, who restrainedly waved her hand, trying not to show too much emotion. Inside, Bridger and Lynx sat, standing up as soon as she entered. Martha saw a mixture of relief and worry on their faces. She hugged Abby, who held on so tightly, as if she didn't want to let go. Finally, Martha went into the kitchen, where she briefly described her meeting with the FBI agent and how she hadn't received any guarantees. But the material had been handed over, and that was already a step toward more serious forces getting involved. Lynx asked impatiently how long it would take to get results. Martha spread her hands. "He said maybe a few weeks, if there's no pressure from above, and maybe faster if there's a way to connect them to the cartel case. But we can't rely on that alone." Bridger then entered the conversation, telling Martha about the night attack on Hopkins's farm and the shootout that nearly cost him his life. Martha listened and frowned. "This is heading for bloodshed. We can't sit back." Lynx looked up. "We're ready for more action. We need to save Carson's wife and gather the men before fear kills them." Martha understood the logic, but she remembered Dan's words about any rash attack only giving the cartel an excuse to deploy even more force. Perhaps everything depended on the precision and coordination of their steps. To sit and wait would mean losing the moral advantage. To rush headlong into battle would mean putting many lives at risk. They began to discuss various scenarios.